The desert wind carried whispers of death across the crimson mesa as Jake Morrison rode his weathered stallion through the narrow canyon pass. Dust devils danced on the horizon like ghostly spirits, and the setting sun painted the rocks the color of dried blood. His leather chaps creaked with each movement of his horse, and sweat beaded beneath the brim of his hat despite the cooling evening air. Jake had been tracking cattle rustlers for 3 days now, following their trail deeper into Apache territory than any sensible man would venture. The railroad company paid good money for recovered livestock, and Jake needed every dollar he could scrape together to keep his small ranch from falling into the bank's greedy hands. His wife Sarah had begged him not to take this job, her blue eyes filled with worry as she watched him pack his saddlebags. But bills didn't pay themselves, and their infant daughter needed medicine the town doctor couldn't provide on credit. As twilight deepened into purple shadows, Jake's horse suddenly reared, snorting in alarm. There, partially hidden behind a cluster of sagebrush and tumbled rocks, lay a figure dressed in buckskin and adorned with eagle feathers. Blood darkened the earth around the man's body, and his breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his Colt revolver, but something in the wounded man's eyes stayed his hand. This was no ordinary Apache warrior. The intricate beadwork on his clothing, the silver armband catching the last rays of sunlight, and the air of authority that clung to him even in his weakened state marked him as a chief. Jake had heard stories of Chief Standing Bear, a leader known for both his fierce protection of his people and his attempts at peaceful negotiation with the white settlers. If this was indeed the chief, Jake faced a decision that could change everything. The smart thing would be to ride away, to pretend he'd never seen the wounded leader. Getting involved with Apache affairs was a sure way to end up scalped and forgotten in some nameless canyon. But as Jake looked into the chief's dark eyes, he saw something that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. The desperate hope of a father who wanted to live to see his children again. Without another moment's hesitation, Jake dismounted and knelt beside the wounded chief. The man had taken a bullet to the shoulder and another to his thigh, and by the looks of the dried blood, he'd been lying there for hours. Jake pulled his canteen from his saddle and carefully lifted the chief's head, allowing him to drink. The water seemed to revive the Apache leader slightly, and his eyes focused on Jake with surprising clarity. "Why do you help me, white man?" the chief asked in accented but clear English. His voice was weak, but carried the weight of command, even in his vulnerable state. Jake began tearing strips from his spare shirt to bind the wounds. "Because it's the right thing to do," he replied simply. "A man's a man, regardless of the color of his skin." As Jake worked to stop the bleeding, the chief studied his face. "You are not like the others who come to our land seeking gold and cattle. There is honor in your eyes." He winced as Jake tightened a bandage around his shoulder. "I am Standing Bear of the Mescalero Apache. My people will be searching for me." "Then we'd better get you somewhere safe," Jake said, helping the chief to his feet. "Can you ride?" Standing Bear nodded, though Jake could see the effort it took for him to remain upright. Jake boosted him onto his horse and climbed up behind him, taking the reins. They couldn't return to Jake's ranch. That would only bring trouble to Sarah and the baby. But Jake knew of an old line shack about 5 miles north, abandoned since the winter when wolves had driven off the cattle. It would have to do. As they rode through the darkness, Standing Bear shared his story. He'd been returning from a peace council with neighboring tribes when bounty hunters had ambushed him, hoping to collect the reward the territorial governor had secretly placed on his head. He'd managed to escape, but not before taking their bullets. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been working toward peace when violence had nearly claimed his life. The line shack appeared like a ghostly silhouette against the star-studded sky. Jake helped Standing Bear inside and got a fire going in the old stone hearth. The flickering flames revealed a single room with rough wooden walls, a few pieces of broken furniture, and years of accumulated dust. It wasn't much, but it would shield them from the cold mountain air and prying eyes. For 3 days, Jake tended to Standing Bear's wounds while keeping watch for any sign of pursuit. He'd sent word to his wife through a passing merchant that he'd been delayed, not wanting her to worry but unable to explain the true reason for his absence. The chief's condition slowly improved under Jake's care, and during the long hours of recovery, the two men shared stories that bridged the gap between their worlds. Standing Bear spoke of his childhood, learning the ways of his people from his grandfather, a medicine man who had taught him that wisdom came not from conquering enemies but from understanding them. He told Jake about his wife, Gentle Rain, and his 3 children, 2 sons who were learning to become warriors, and a daughter who reminded him of a spring flower blooming after a harsh winter. The love in his voice when he spoke of his family was universal, something Jake understood completely. In return, Jake shared his own struggles, how he'd come west after the war, seeking a fresh start and a place where a man could make something of himself through honest work. He spoke of Sarah, whom he'd met at a church social in the growing town of Cedar Ridge, and how her laughter had been the first truly beautiful sound he'd heard since leaving the battlefield. He told Standing Bear about their daughter Emma, born just 6 months ago with tiny fists, and her mother's determined spirit. "We are not so different, you and I," Standing Bear observed as Jake changed his bandages on the 3rd evening. "We both fight to protect what we love." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Jake quickly extinguished the fire and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. In the moonlight, he could see at least a dozen riders approaching the shack, their faces painted for war. These were Standing Bear's warriors, and they'd finally tracked down their chief. Standing Bear struggled to his feet despite Jake's protests. "They will kill you if they find you here with me," he whispered urgently. "You must go. Now, while there is still time." But Jake shook his head. "I'm not leaving you to face this alone. If they're your men, then explain the situation. Tell them I helped you." "You do not understand," Standing Bear said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "They do not know I was working toward peace. They believe the white settlers cannot be trusted, that the only way to survive is through war. If they see you here, they will assume you are responsible for my wounds." The Apache warriors surrounded the line shack with the silent efficiency of wolves closing in on prey. Jake could hear their horses breathing in the cold night air, could sense their readiness for violence like a living thing pressing against the walls. Standing Bear had insisted on meeting his men alone, despite his weakened condition, but Jake refused to hide like a coward. As the chief limped toward the door, Jake placed a restraining hand on his shoulder. "We face this together," he said quietly. "If they're going to judge me, let them do it while looking me in the eye." Standing Bear nodded, respect evident in his expression. Together, the 2 men stepped out into the moonlight. The warriors immediately raised their weapons, rifles, bows, and traditional war clubs gleaming in the pale light. Their leader, a fierce-looking brave with a scar running down his left cheek, spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone urgent and questioning. Standing Bear raised his hand for silence and responded in their native tongue. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the authority in the chief's voice, the careful explanation of events. As Standing Bear spoke, Jake noticed the warriors' expressions changing from hostility to confusion, then to something approaching wonder. The scarred warrior, whom Standing Bear later introduced as Red Hawk, his war chief, stepped forward and studied Jake with intelligent dark eyes. When Standing Bear finished his account, Red Hawk spoke in broken English. "You saved our chief when you could have left him to die. You risked your life for a man of another people. This is unexpected. It's what any decent man would do," Jake replied simply. Red Hawk translated for the others, and a murmur went through the group. Several warriors actually smiled, and one of the younger ones looked at Jake with obvious admiration. But not all were convinced. An older warrior with graying hair and suspicious eyes spoke harshly to Standing Bear, gesturing angrily at Jake. Standing Bear's response was firm and final. The old warrior fell silent, but his hostile glare never left Jake's face. The chief turned to Jake and explained, "Grey Wolf believes this is a trap, that you are working with the bounty hunters to capture me alive for a greater reward. He counsels my warriors to kill you now, and trust no white man." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jake could feel a dozen weapons trained on him, could sense the warriors' readiness to strike at their chief's slightest nod. His hand rested casually near his gun, though he knew he'd never clear leather before they cut him down. The standoff stretched into long, tense minutes as Standing Bear argued with his war council. Jake couldn't understand the rapid Apache dialogue, but he could read the body language clearly enough. Half the warriors wanted him dead, while the others seemed willing to trust their chief's judgment. Red Hawk appeared to be the deciding factor, his scarred face thoughtful as he listened to the debate. Finally, Standing Bear raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable ring of absolute authority. "This man, Jake Morrison, is under my protection. He has shown honor when he could have chosen safety. He has proven that not all white men are our enemies. Any warrior who harms him will answer to me personally." Grey Wolf spat in the dust and turned away, clearly disgusted with his chief's decision. But the others nodded acceptance, and Red Hawk actually stepped forward to offer Jake his hand in a gesture of respect. "My chief has spoken truly," Red Hawk said in his careful English. "You have honor, Jake Morrison, but you cannot return to your home. The bounty hunters who wounded Standing Bear are still searching. They have many men, and they know of your ranch. Your family is in danger." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. In his concern for Standing Bear, he'd forgotten about the men who had shot the chief. If they were still in the area, if they'd somehow connected him to the Apache leader's disappearance, then Sarah and little Emma were indeed at risk. Standing Bear placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. "We will not forget this debt. My warriors will watch over your family while we deal with these bounty hunters. No harm will come to your wife and child while they are under Apache protection." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Red Hawk selected 6 of his best warriors to guard Jake's ranch, while the rest prepared for a hunt of their own. The bounty hunters had made the mistake of entering Apache territory and threatening one of their own. Now they would learn the price of such arrogance. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jake found himself riding alongside men he'd been taught to fear and hate. But as he watched them prepare for battle, he saw not savage enemies but fathers and sons, brothers and friends, united in their determination to protect their loved ones. The realization that they were not so different from himself struck him with unexpected force. Standing Bear, despite his wounds, insisted on leading the war party. His presence seemed to transform the warriors from a group of individual fighters into a coordinated force of nature. Jake had served in the cavalry during the war and thought he understood military discipline. But watching these Apache warriors move with silent, deadly precision was like witnessing poetry written in steel and sinew. The bounty hunters had made camp in Devil's Canyon, a narrow gorge that offered good defensive positions but only one way in or out. Jake counted at least 15 men, all heavily armed and clearly experienced in frontier violence. Their leader was a bear of a man with a grizzled beard and cruel eyes, someone Jake recognized as Bart Hutchins, a former Confederate officer who'd turned to hunting men for money after the war ended. From their concealed position on the canyon rim, Standing Bear studied the camp below with the calculating gaze of a master tactician. Despite his injuries, the chief moved with fluid grace, positioning his warriors with subtle hand signals that spoke of years of coordinated warfare. "They expect us to charge down the canyon like wild animals," Standing Bear whispered to Jake. "White men always underestimate Apache intelligence. They will learn better today." The attack came at noon, when the sun was directly overhead and the bounty hunters' shadows offered no concealment. But it didn't come from the canyon mouth as expected. Instead, Apache warriors appeared as if by magic on the canyon walls, their presence announced only by the whistle of arrows and the sharp crack of rifle fire. The bounty hunters scrambled for cover, but they were caught in a perfectly executed crossfire. Standing Bear had positioned his men to command every inch of the canyon floor, turning the defensive position into a death trap. Jake watched in amazement as the Apache warriors moved like ghosts among the rocks, appearing and disappearing with deadly efficiency. Hutchins tried to rally his men for a breakout charge, but Red Hawk had anticipated this move. A line of warriors rose from concealment at the canyon mouth, their weapons trained on anyone foolish enough to attempt escape. The battle was over almost before it began, with most of the bounty hunters surrendering rather than face certain annihilation. But Hutchins wasn't finished. The big man had spotted Jake among the Apache warriors and seemed to recognize him from somewhere. "Morrison," he bellowed across the canyon. "I know you, you traitorous son of a bitch. You're working with these savages." Before Jake could respond, Hutchins raised his rifle and took careful aim. The shot echoed off the canyon walls, but it was Standing Bear who threw himself forward, taking the bullet meant for Jake. The chief collapsed, his carefully bandaged wounds reopening as he hit the rocky ground. Red Hawk's answering shot took Hutchins in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the dust. The remaining bounty hunters threw down their weapons and raised their hands, but Jake's attention was focused entirely on Standing Bear, who was bleeding heavily from his reopened shoulder wound. The Apache warriors formed a protective circle around their wounded chief, as Jake worked frantically to stop the bleeding. Standing Bear had taken a bullet dangerously close to his heart, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Red Hawk knelt beside Jake, his scarred face etched with worry as he watched his leader's life ebbing away. "Why did you do that?" Jake demanded, pressing fresh bandages against the wound. "That bullet was meant for me," Standing Bear managed a weak smile. Because you are my brother now. Brothers protect each other. The word sent a shock through Jake that had nothing to do with the violence they'd just witnessed. In all his years on the frontier, he'd never heard an Apache use that term for a white man. The significance wasn't lost on the other warriors either. Several nodded solemnly, while others touched their hands to their hearts in a gesture of respect. Red Hawk spoke rapidly to the other warriors, and they immediately began preparations to move the chief. Jake watched in fascination as they constructed a travois from their lances and blankets, creating a comfortable litter that would allow them to transport Standing Bear without aggravating his injuries. We take him to our village, Red Hawk explained to Jake. Our medicine man can heal him better than white doctors. I'm coming with you, Jake said without hesitation. Red Hawk shook his head. Apache village is sacred place. White men not permitted, but Standing Bear, despite his weakness, spoke firmly to his war chief in their native tongue. Red Hawk's eyebrows rose in surprise, and he looked at Jake with new respect. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. Chief says you have earned right to enter our village. You have shed blood for Apache people, risked your life for our leader. You are welcome among us. The journey to the Apache village took most of the day, winding through hidden trails that Jake never could have found on his own. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, their ponies picking their way along paths that seemed to disappear and reappear like miracles of navigation. Jake found himself amazed by their knowledge of the land, their ability to find water and shelter in a landscape that looked utterly barren to his untrained eye. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the desert gave way to pine forests and clear mountain streams. The air grew cooler and filled with the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. Jake realized he was about to see something few white men had ever witnessed, an Apache village in its natural state, unguarded and authentic. The Apache village nestled in a hidden valley like a secret jewel, its wickiups arranged in careful harmony with the natural landscape. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played among the pine trees, and women worked at various tasks with the same efficient grace Jake had observed in their warriors. The entire community seemed to pause as Standing Bear's party entered the village, their faces showing a mixture of relief and concern for their wounded leader. An elderly man with silver-streaked hair and intelligent eyes hurried forward. This was clearly the medicine man Red Hawk had mentioned. He took one look at Standing Bear's condition and began issuing rapid instructions in Apache. Several women appeared with fresh blankets and healing herbs, while young men ran to fetch water from the nearby stream. Jake found himself the object of intense curiosity from the villagers. Children peered at him from behind their mothers' skirts, while elderly warriors studied him with expressions ranging from suspicion to amazement. He was clearly the first white man many of them had ever seen up close, and his presence among their returning war party was cause for considerable discussion. The medicine man, whom Red Hawk introduced as Soaring Eagle, worked over Standing Bear with skills that impressed even Jake's skeptical frontier sensibilities. The old healer's hands moved with sure precision as he cleaned and redressed the wounds, applying poultices made from desert plants Jake couldn't identify. There was something almost mystical about the way Soaring Eagle worked, chanting softly as he ministered to his chief. As the sun set over the hidden valley, Jake sat beside Standing Bear's bedside in the chief's own wickiup. The Apache leader's condition had stabilized, though he remained unconscious and pale. Standing Bear's wife, Gentle Rain, sat across from Jake, her dark eyes filled with gratitude as she watched over her husband. He spoke of you, she said softly in surprisingly good English. He said you risked everything to save him, though you owed him nothing. He would have done the same for me, Jake replied honestly. Gentle Rain smiled, and Jake could see why Standing Bear spoke of her with such love. Despite the worry lines around her eyes, she possessed a serene beauty that seemed to radiate from within. Perhaps, but few men would have made such a choice. My children will grow up knowing that there are good men among all peoples. That night, as Jake tried to sleep on a soft buffalo hide beside the chief's bedside, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 3 days ago, he'd been a simple rancher, tracking stolen cattle. Now he was a guest in an Apache village, trusted friend to a chief he'd never met before, and somehow caught up in events that seemed far larger than his simple desires for a peaceful life. The next morning brought wonderful news. Standing Bear's fever had broken, and he was conscious and alert. Weak but lucid, the chief smiled at Jake and gripped his hand firmly. My friend, he said softly, you have given me the greatest gift. Time to see my children grow and my people prosper. How can such a debt ever be repaid? Standing Bear's recovery progressed steadily over the following days, and Jake found himself increasingly integrated into the daily life of the Apache village. The initial suspicion of the villagers gradually gave way to acceptance and even friendship. Children who had once hidden from him now followed him around with curious eyes, and the warriors began including him in their evening discussions around the central fire. He learned that the Apache way of life was far more complex and sophisticated than the savage stereotype promoted by frontier newspapers. These people had a rich culture, complex social structures, and a deep spiritual connection to the land that Jake found both beautiful and profound. They were not the mindless killers described in penny dreadfuls, but a proud people fighting to preserve their way of life against overwhelming odds. Red Hawk became an unexpected friend, teaching Jake basic Apache words and sharing stories of his own battles and adventures. The war chief had initially been suspicious of all white men, but Jake's actions had opened his mind to the possibility that not every pale-skinned settler was an enemy. "You fight well for a farmer," Red Hawk said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Perhaps you should have been born Apache," Jake laughed. But the comment touched him more deeply than he cared to admit. For the first time in years, he felt truly accepted, valued not for what he could provide, but for who he was as a man. The experience was both humbling and transformative. On the 5th day, a young warrior rode into the village with news that would change everything. The territorial governor had declared martial law in response to Standing Bear's disappearance, and federal troops were being deployed to pacify the region. More ominously, bounty hunters and militia groups were forming throughout the territory, determined to claim the substantial reward still offered for Standing Bear's capture. The chief called a council meeting that very evening. Jake was surprised to find himself invited to participate, sitting in the circle of elders and war leaders as they debated their people's future. The discussion was intense, with some voices calling for war and others counseling patience and diplomacy. Standing Bear listened to all opinions before speaking. When he finally rose, despite his still healing wounds, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "We have lived in peace with some white settlers and fought others when necessary. But the time for hiding is over. They want war, and perhaps war is what they shall have. But first, we try one more time for peace." He turned to Jake, his eyes reflecting both hope and desperate determination. "My friend, you have seen our people as we truly are. You know we are not the monsters they claim. Will you carry a message to your leaders? Will you speak for peace when others call for war?" Jake felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. The decision he made in the next few moments could determine the fate of two peoples, could mean the difference between peace and a bloody conflict that would devastate the frontier. Every eye in the circle was upon him, waiting for his answer. "I'll do it," he said simply. "I'll carry your message and do everything in my power to prevent this war." The journey back to Cedar Ridge took Jake through country that seemed transformed by his recent experiences. The same landscapes that had once appeared harsh and forbidding now revealed hidden beauty and subtle majesty. He carried with him not only Standing Bear's message of peace but also a new understanding of the land and its original inhabitants. Sarah was waiting on the porch when he rode up to their ranch, baby Emma in her arms and worry lines creasing her beautiful face. She ran to meet him, and Jake held both his wife and daughter close, breathing in the familiar sense of home and family. But even as he rejoiced in their reunion, he could see Apache warriors watching from the nearby hills. Red Hawk had kept his promise to protect Jake's family. That evening, as Sarah listened in amazement to his account of the past week, Jake struggled to find words adequate to describe his transformation. How could he explain that helping a wounded enemy had taught him more about humanity than all his years of frontier struggle? How could he convey the profound connection he'd felt to people he'd been taught to fear and hate? "They're just people, Sarah," he finally said. "Parents who love their children, men who want to protect their families, women who worry about their husbands. They're no different from us." The next morning, Jake rode into Cedar Ridge to deliver Standing Bear's message to the territorial authorities. The town was in an uproar, with militia groups forming and wild rumors flying about Apache raids and massacres. Jake found himself branded a traitor by some and a hero by others when word spread of his role in the recent events. The territorial governor, a pompous man named William Crawford, received Jake in his temporary office with barely concealed hostility. Crawford was clearly disappointed that Standing Bear had escaped the bounty hunters, and he listened to the chief's peace proposal with obvious skepticism. "You expect me to negotiate with savages?" Crawford sneered. These Apache have been raiding settlements and stealing cattle for years. The only message they understand is force. That's not true, Jake replied firmly. Chief Standing Bear is willing to discuss treaties, boundaries, compensation for past grievances. He wants peace for his people. But Jake could see that Crawford had already made his decision. The governor wanted a military solution that would advance his political career, not a peaceful resolution that might require actual effort and compromise. The meeting ended with Crawford's promise to consider the proposal, but Jake knew the man had no intention of pursuing peace. Discouraged but not defeated, Jake tried a different approach. He began speaking to anyone who would listen: merchants, ranchers, church groups, anyone with influence in the community. He told them about his experiences in the Apache village, about the humanity he'd discovered in supposed enemies, about the possibility of coexistence rather than conflict. Some dismissed him as an Apache sympathizer or worse, but others listened with growing interest. A few prominent ranchers, tired of the constant cycle of raids and retaliation, began to see the wisdom in his words. The town preacher, Reverend Matthews, was particularly supportive, declaring from his pulpit that peace was always preferable to war. Slowly, incrementally, Jake began to change minds and hearts. It wasn't easy. Generations of mistrust and fear couldn't be overcome overnight. But his personal testimony, his obvious sincerity, and the simple logic of his arguments gradually won converts to the cause of peace. The breakthrough came when Standing Bear himself appeared in Cedar Ridge, accompanied by a small honor guard of his most trusted warriors. The Apache chief had recovered enough to travel, and he came to speak directly to the white settlers about his vision of peaceful coexistence. The town square was packed as Standing Bear addressed the crowd in his careful but eloquent English. He spoke of his people's love for the land, their desire to raise their children in peace, their willingness to share the vast territories with settlers who showed respect for Apache rights and customs. "We do not ask you to leave," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent square. "We ask only that you remember we were here first, and that this land is large enough for all who treat it with respect." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some jeered and shouted insults, while others listened with obvious interest and growing sympathy. But something had changed in Cedar Ridge that day. For the first time, many settlers had heard an Apache leader speak as a man rather than a monster, had seen the dignity and humanity in their supposed enemies. Governor Crawford, furious that Standing Bear had appeared in public rather than surrendering to authorities, ordered his arrest. But the town sheriff, a pragmatic man named Tom Bradley, refused to comply. "That man came here under a flag of truce to talk peace," Bradley declared. "I won't be the one to break that trust." The confrontation between federal authority and local autonomy created a political crisis that ultimately reached Washington, D.C. While politicians debated policy, Jake and Standing Bear continued their quiet campaign for understanding and reconciliation. The resolution came in an unexpected way. A severe winter storm trapped a group of settlers, including Governor Crawford himself, in a remote cabin. Apache warriors, acting on Standing Bear's orders, rescued the stranded whites and provided them with food and shelter until the storm passed. Crawford's rescue by the very savages he'd been determined to destroy proved to be a transforming experience. Faced with Apache generosity and humanity when he'd expected only cruelty, the governor finally agreed to serious negotiations. The treaty signed that spring wasn't perfect. No treaty ever is. Both sides made compromises, accepted boundaries they didn't entirely like, and agreed to provisions that would require constant vigilance to maintain. But it was a beginning, a foundation upon which something better could be built. Jake found himself appointed as a liaison between the Apache and the territorial government, a role that suited his temperament and his unique understanding of both cultures. His ranch prospered as trade developed between Apache and white communities, and his family grew to include 2 more children who would grow up in a world where former enemies had learned to be neighbors. Years later, as an old man sitting on his porch watching Apache and white children play together in his yard, Jake would reflect on the chain of events that had started with a simple act of compassion. He had saved one wounded man's life, and in return had received far more than he could ever have imagined. Friendship, understanding, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from helping to build a better world. Standing Bear had been right all along. They had become brothers. And brothers, Jake had learned, protect not just each other, but the future they hoped to leave for their children. In saving the Apache chief, Jake had ultimately saved something far more precious: the possibility that people of different races and cultures could choose understanding over hatred, peace over war, and hope over fear. The desert wind still carried whispers across the mesa, but now they spoke not of death but of life, not of endings but of new beginnings. And in the quiet moments before sleep, Jake could hear them clearly, the voices of all those who had chosen to build bridges instead of walls, to heal instead of harm, to love instead of hate. The story of Jake Morrison and Standing Bear became legend in the territory, passed down through generations as proof that one person's courage and compassion could change the course of history. It was a reminder that in the vast complexity of human relations, simple acts of decency could have consequences far beyond their humble origins. And sometimes, late at night when the moon was full and the desert sang its ancient songs, travelers claimed they could still see two figures riding together across the mesa, a cowboy and a chief, brothers in spirit if not in blood, forever journeying toward a horizon bright with promise and hope.